Okay, troubles on the stock market. So some people were engaging in speculation, which is essentially buying stocks without doing much research and ignoring the risks. Others were buying on margin, which means to buy stocks on credit, which is basically as bad as making a bet with money you don't even have to back up or back it up with. So because of these two things, the stock market does appear to be doing well in the mid to late 1920s, but it's really not doing that great because people aren't really able to afford the stocks they're investing in, and they're investing blindly. So the stock market will inevitably crash. Alright, and it's kind of because people get paranoid in the actions they take, and so I'm going to kind of go through the steps here, but the only date you really need to know is the last one, and I'll specify that in a second. But I do have some steps. So in September of 1929, prices in the stock market took a slight dip, meaning the market kind of declined a little bit. The worth of a lot of companies declined, and that made people nervous. So some people began to sell their stock and pull their money out of the stock market, which just makes it less strong. Now, October 24th, 1929, the market took an even greater plunge. And this is all going to come to a head on October 29, 1929. And that's the date you need to know, October 29th, 1929. The stock market totally crashed. A record number of stocks were sold that day, meaning a record number of people sold their stocks and pulled their money out of the stock market, making it a lot less valuable. People are selling their stock for a lot less than what they had initially bought it for, so they're losing money that way. But then if you also didn't sell your stock in time, the market was already crashed, and so what you had invested in the stock market literally disappeared, and your investment is now worth nothing. Investors had lost about a total of $30 billion. So the Great Depression is kind of begun with the crash of the stock market on Black Tuesday. And the Great Depression is the period between 1929 and 1940 when the economy was doing very poorly and unemployment was very high. Now it's important to know the crash alone did not cause the Great Depression. It's one of the many causes we'll talk about. Okay, banks and business failures. So, because of paranoia, after the crash, many people withdrew their money from banks. And when you pull all the money out of the banks, then banks start going bankrupt. They don't really have the money to stay afloat without their investors. So without people keeping their money in the banks became worth nothing. So they went bankrupt. And then businesses at the same time, people weren't buying things as much. So businesses aren't making profit. So businesses are having to close down. They will then have to fire people. So people lose jobs. Now they have even less money. It's just a never-ending cycle. Now, worldwide shockwaves, and I don't need you to know this specific tariff, so don't stress about that. But what's on the screen. But I want you to know that the U.S. is not alone affected by the Great Depression. The effects are felt in Europe and abroad because the U.S. was not importing as many goods from Europe. They're not buying as much. So those European businesses that are used to American business are not profiting as well. So businesses, businesses abroad suffered, and so the depression is felt abroad. Now, another thing that had already made it harder for, and this is the part you don't really need to know, I just wanted to kind of introduce this tariff real fast, just for your own benefit, but another reason businesses are already suffering in the U.S. is that we had a very high tariff known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act in place, which, remember, protects American business by, it charges a tax on imported goods so that people are encouraged to buy local products rather than foreign products. But because we have tariffs in place, those other countries are also going to put tariffs on goods that we are exporting to try to sell in other countries. So then we have to pay tariffs. So it's harder for us to sell our goods abroad, just like we aren't buying goods from our foreign businessmen. And then for the 5 actual causes of the Great Depression. Tariffs, the farmers in crisis, and remember the farmers are in crisis because they are producing more than what is in demand, so their profits plummeted, and then they're not able to produce anything. People are buying too much on credit, and unequal distribution of income, and of course the stock market crash. Alright, hardship and suffering during the Depression. So people are very devastated by the Depression, and we're going to look at the effects on both cities and rural areas. In cities, people lost jobs, they were evicted from homes, they were without food, they had no place to sleep. So to try to make up for this, we see several things happen. One, people who lived in cities built shanty towns. And I have that spelling on the screen, SHANTYTOWNS, shanty towns. Shanty towns were little towns of shacks, made up of any kind of scrap material, whether it be wood or tin. And then the other thing that was put into place were soup kitchens and bread lines. And these were usually provided by charity. It was basically free food to those who needed it. Here's some pictures. This is what shanty towns look like. You would imagine to see this somewhere like a third world country today, not in the United States. Now, things in rural areas were not any better. Farmers are known to grow their own food. But unfortunately, with farmers in crisis, many of them are not able to afford their mortgage, which includes the property they own or on which they farm. So they lose their land. The Dust Bowl does not make things any better. And the Dust Bowl consisted of dust storms all across the Midwest, caused by drought and high winds. And you don't need to know this next slide, but how the Dust Bowl actually happened. Essentially, the land was overproduced during World War I, and so is left very dry. Mixed with a drought, when you don't have a lot of rain, your grass isn't growing. So you just have this top layer of soil and dirt. You don't have any grass. And that's really bad for the soil. In the Midwest, where it's very windy, it creates these huge dust storms across the region, and no one's able to grow anything. And there's some pictures here. It's very, very bad. Oh yeah, and as far as effects of the Dust Bowl, Route 66 becomes a very traveled road as people have to flee the Midwestern region to escape. Okay, effects on the American family. most people, most families experienced a sense of unity during the Great Depression because they had to survive together. They'd often stay at home and entertain themselves with things like board games. Board games like Monopoly became very popular. Now, in some cases, families did break apart. Men had to leave their families looking for other job opportunities. Some would come back with money, but some would not. Some abandoned their families to try to find work and survive by hopping from town to town. And so that left women to kind of pick up a lot of slack. Women worked really hard to keep their families fed and taken care of. They did things like can food and sew all the clothes in the family. Many had to work outside of the home, and this was looked down upon in some cases because women who worked were seen as taking away a job from the man. Children definitely suffered. They had poor diets. There was a lack of health care, and many children had serious malnourishment and health problems during the Depression. As far as the social and psychological effects, we definitely see people not taking care of their health. People kind of stop going to the doctor or dentist. Many people put their dreams of either going to college or getting married and starting a family off for later. We see people delaying getting married because now is not the time to worry about starting a family and bringing children into the world. Now is the time for survival. And the stigma of, never being wasteful and almost to the level of hoarding never really goes away. And it becomes very common at this time for families and future generations to feel like they need to save everything. That's kind of a Depression-era mentality. All right, Hoover struggles with the Great Depression. Now we know President Herbert Hoover was the president when the Great Depression began, and unfortunately his philosophy is one that's kind of harsh. It was known as rugged individualism. And within his philosophy, he believed that people could improve their situation through their own efforts, and that they should not depend on the government to bail them out. So there's really not a lot of direct relief the government is providing to the people under Hoover's presidency, which kind of makes him wildly unpopular, because this is the greatest economic turmoil in U.S. history, and he doesn't really want to do a whole lot. Now he does do a few things, but it's kind of just not enough to really make a big difference. One thing he did propose was the construction of the Boulder Dam. This would be a massive dam on the Colorado River. And it would provide electricity, water, and flood control to all states on the Colorado River. Most importantly, it provided jobs for its construction. And because it was kind of his suggestion, the Boulder Dam does become known what it is today, the Hoover Dam. Now, because people did not really like Herbert Hoover, in the congressional elections of 1930, we're going to see a large number of Democrats win office. And you can assume that Herbert Hoover, based on that number, or based on that fact, is a Republican. So people are unsupportive of Hoover and the Republican Party. It's not time for a new president. 1930 is not an election year for the presidency, because he was elected in 28, so that's not going to come until 32. But in 1930, we're going to see a very large number of Democrats elected to Congress. And I think because of him being a little afraid of how public opinion felt about him, he starts doing a few more things. So Hoover takes more action. 2 things he puts into place in his presidency. Number 1, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. This did 2 things. It lowered mortgage rates for homeowners, and it allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans and avoid foreclosure. Lastly, we see the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. This authorized a large amount of federal funding to go towards emergency financing for banks and other large businesses. Now, while many people saw this as Hoover helping only the big businesses out by bailing them out of bankruptcy, he is hopeful that the money will trickle down to the average citizen through job growth. So essentially, by bailing out some of the large businesses, those businesses will now be able to hire more people. Now there'll be more people working. Now more people will have more money. They'll go out and buy more things at the store. Now that store is back in business. They can hire more people who can have more money to go to the movies, etc., etc. It all kind of trickles down. This is also known as like Reaganomics today. Alright, I know I moved quickly, but I wanted to get through it, and y'all have the 3 days to listen to it. Take your time, write down any questions, and I will see y'all on Tuesday. Have a good 3-day weekend.